I'm here with Dr. Peter Edwards, Australia's leading authority on the Vietnam War and Australia's involvement in it. We recently published Australia and the Vietnam War, and has just finished a robust presentation on how Australia goes to war. Lessons from Vietnam. Dr. Edwards, welcome.
Thank you.
In your talk, you mentioned a popular phrase, mainly that Australia fights other people's wars. We're approaching the centenary of the First World War, which Britain entered at the behest of Great Britain. After the Second World War, we entered into the ANZUS alliance with the United States. To what degree has Australia's war-making policy been tied into these two great powers?
Both more and less than one might expect, if that doesn't sound a diplomatic way of having both sides. Yes, we have always sought security through a great alliance, preferably with more than one ally. But it is equally true that we have generally sought to use those alliances or those relationships in Australia's national interests, to promote and defend Australia's national interests as they were seen at the time. So when we entered the First World War, it was clear that if Britain had lost to Germany in 1914-18, it would have had a very severe impact on Australia. Now, the cost that we paid was horrendous, but certainly a victorious Germany in our part of the world would not have been a comfortable thing for Australia. And similarly, the Second World War, it wasn't just the Pacific War against Japan that was important for us. Again, a victorious Germany or the fascist powers in 39-45 would not have been a good result for Australia, for the sort of world that we prosper in.
In your concluding chapter, you mentioned, contrary to public opinion, that Australia didn't join Vietnam solely as a sort of lapdog of the US, but rather they wanted the US to engage in Vietnam for our own national security. Why is this contrary opinion so popular?
I think it was seen at the time because America was so powerful and because it was so strongly identified with the war. It was easy to assume that we had gone in simply because the United States wanted us in. And it is certainly true that the United States did want it. It wanted as many allies as possible. It wanted to be seen as acting on behalf of the free nations of the world, not just on America's own national interests. But the reason why I challenge that view is because as it was perceived by Prime Minister Menzies, and I think many of those around him at the time, Vietnam was really Australia's war. He was concerned that the Americans might withdraw, as seemed very likely. There was a huge fight going on between the Hawks and the Doves in Washington over what America should do. And Menzies was very concerned that the Doves might win, that the Americans might not fight the war, but resort to diplomatic negotiations. He said at one point in a discussion with a very small group of ministers that were making the key decisions, he said, "We're looking for a way in and not a way out." So he was not trying to resist American pressure. He was trying to put pressure on the Americans to stay there. Now, I think it was a flawed judgment as to what could happen. It was a flawed judgment over America's capacity to influence events in that part of the world. But it was Australia's judgment in Australia's interests as he saw them at that time.
In the present day, especially for someone like me as an undergraduate, are we doomed to view these events in hindsight? I mean, for example, I was born around the time communism was dying, whereas in the 1960s, the domino theory was sort of a credible idea. How important as an historian is it to go back to, I suppose, the popular opinion and ideas of policymakers at those times, rather than looking back from the present day?
I think what the historian has to do is both. Yes, we use hindsight, but we also have to understand what was known at the time, what was believed at the time, to try and sort out what was valid and what wasn't, with the benefit of what we now know. probably the best historian of the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis, wrote a book called We Now Know, which is a reassessment of the Cold War with all that benefit of hindsight. So the historian has got to be simultaneously critical where criticism is due, but to also have that criticism based on what was known at the time, what could have been understood, what was simply a matter of judgment, good or bad judgment, and what was, what was flawed thinking or logic.
You mentioned Australia's independence of policy during the Malayan emergency and the Indonesian confrontation. Do you think this has sustained itself to, I guess, more contemporary wars like Iraq and Afghanistan?
In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. I think, for example, our involvement in Iraq was very different from the involvement in Vietnam. We hadn't been pressing the Americans to get involved in Iraq before that commitment was made, the way we had been pressing the Americans to say committed to the defence of Vietnam. That clearly, I think, was a commitment that was simply in the interests of alliance maintenance, of supporting the US alliance. So we're not doomed to repeat the follies of the past, but independent diplomacy is always something that we should be exercising. And as I said in my presentation, we really need and rely upon a good, strong, independent and well-resourced diplomatic service that can give good, independent advice to the government of the day, and to have a government that will heed that advice, look at it critically, not accept it automatically, but will accept good advice when it is given.
And lastly, I hope this isn't too broad. Do you view the West and Australia's involvement in Vietnam as a mistake? Was delaying the Vietnam domino for 10 years worth the national wealth and treasure?
It was. It's a hard call. It was worthwhile to some extent, and Lee Kuan Yew is the most well-known proponent of that view, that it was very worthwhile because the regional situation in '75 was so different from what it had been in 1965. But having said that, a lot of the benefits had been gained by about 1968-69, and I think the really unfortunate part is not that the commitment was made in '64, '65, but that it was made in such a way that it was very difficult to exit at a time when the costs were starting to outweigh the benefits. It's a complex answer to your question, but it's the best I can do.
Right. Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.